to perhaps become the first nation in the world where you will see such a tax implemented. Most of you have probably already had the chance to have a first look at the recommendations, but this afternoon we are glad to have invited two very capable speakers to give us some more details and also some comments on the proposal that's now on the table. The report has been underway for a long time, and with its release this week, it of course coincides with a wider, at least European debate about the future condition for farmers in Europe, and therefore I think at least a few eyes from abroad will probably also be on Denmark to see what we have or will come up with. So I'm very pleased to welcome this afternoon economist and professor Peter Birch Sørensen from the University of Copenhagen. Peter has been part of the expert group, so he knows the ins and outs of the recommendations, and also in his wider research area at the moment he's working on economics of climate change, among other things. So that's quite interesting too. Also with us, I'm very delighted to introduce Bjarke Møller, who is director of the environmental organization Green Transition Denmark. And some of you who knows Bjarne will also know that he was former with the think tank Europa, also here in Denmark. So before I give the floor to our two speakers, we have agreed they will do a presentation. First, we'll go to Peter and then to Bjarne, and then we'll open up for questions. And we, of course, will take some questions here from the room and also try to, via the chat in Zoom, to accommodate some questions from Zoom. Also for all of you, just be aware that we record the whole thing here today and will make it available on YouTube afterwards. So, without any more words from me, warm welcome. Peter, welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the invitation. We just delivered a sizable report to the Danish government and parliament today. It contains a lot of stuff. I'll try to concentrate on the essentials. So this expert group on green tax reform, as we were called, was given the mandate to propose a future architecture for carbon taxation in Denmark, including taxation of non-energy related emissions from agriculture, which, as you probably know, is mainly methane, emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. The mandate was to find propose cost-effective ways of meeting Denmark's national target of reducing emissions from Danish territory by 70% from by 2030, measured relative to 1990. And also, it was part of our mandate to try to secure that our proposals also ensured that Denmark would meet by 2030 our obligations towards the European Union within the EU burden sharing agreement and the regulation on land use and land use change in the EU. So there was some targets set up. We were supposed to suggest ways of meeting the targets in a so-called cost-effective way, but we were also asked to include other considerations such as effects on income distribution, on effects on the geographical distribution of income, and trying to avoid carbon leakage of greenhouse gases from Danish territory to other countries. So it was a fairly complicated mandate involving quite a lot of targets, which in reality are impossible to meet 100% at the same time. So we decided to describe three different ways of meeting the national climate target and our EU obligations by 2030. in 3 different ways that include different weights on these various considerations. So we already, in a previous report, had proposed an architecture for carbon taxation for Danish industry and manufacturing and energy sectors. The remaining big chunk of Danish emissions that are not yet covered by a carbon tax scheme is Danish agriculture, which is expected to account for about 46% of total Danish emissions by 2030. So it's a big chunk, and I guess what is most interesting for an international audience is how can we implement a carbon tax scheme. I'll call it a carbon tax scheme, even if we're talking about a taxation of emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, but basically let's just call it a carbon tax scheme for agriculture. It's been considered more or less impossible so far to measure emissions from individual farm units, and that is one reason I believe why no country so far has ever tried to implement a carbon tax on agriculture. But in Denmark we are in the position that Danish farmers are already, as part of our veterinary regulations to regulate sort of food security, farmers are obliged to report to a central register all the animals they have on stock of different types. We also have a national regulation of use of nitrogen via fertilizer and manure and so on in Danish agriculture, where farmers are obliged to give detailed reports, detailed information about how much fertilizer they use, what kind of crops they grow and so on, as part of our regulation of nitrogen use, which aims at protecting our water environment. So we have a lot of information already that farmers are obliged to report, and basically using that information, combining that with the methods of measuring emissions in our Danish national inventory, as it's called, the official national climate accounts for Denmark, using the emission factors, multiplying them by the various agricultural activities, the number of animals, the amount of manure and fertilizer used, we can actually account for emissions from individual farm units, and that's what we're proposing to do, building mainly on information to public authorities that Danish farmers are already obliged to give, so we expect that the additional administrative burden on farmers will be minimal. The authorities will have to sort of collect this information into one central register. On that basis, they can calculate emissions from individual farm units. So that is sort of the practical implementation platform that we are proposing. Then we're proposing a tax on animals, farm animals, based on the expected amount based on the estimated emissions from the different types of animals, and we have also a tax on the use of manure and fertilizer, which is also based on these emission factors in the Danish national accounts. And in the first model for taxation that we propose to treat farmers on level with all other firms, businesses outside the European Emissions Trading Scheme. For that part of for industry outside the ETS, we are about to phase in a carbon tax at the level of roughly 100 euros by 2030. So in our first model for taxing agriculture, we propose to apply the same tax rate to emissions from agriculture. That's a fairly tough tough treatment for farmers, particularly those with a lot of animals, concentrating on animal production. They will be hit pretty hard. We expect that cattle farmers and dairy farmers will cut their production by 20% or so if we impose a tax at that level. Plant growers will be hit less heavily, but they will also cut production by some 12% or so. So on average, we expect a cut in Danish emissions of about 15%. In that model. Then we have a model where we maintain the same carbon tax rate, but we give a basic deduction from the tax base that effectively lowers the burden, cuts the burden on farmers in half, but at the margin they're still taxed on additional emissions by these 100 euros. So if they manage to change their farming practice so as to reduce emissions per animal, say, then they still save at the margin 100 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. So we maintain the incentive to cut emissions at the margin, but we lower the total tax burden. And in the third model, we say that the part of agriculture which is particularly hard hit, which are cattle farmers and dairy farmers, we lower their effective tax rate to 250 Danish kroner, which is about 33 euros or something like that. In order to not take up too much time, let me just say we have tried to analyze the effects on income distribution of these proposals because we expect some increase in food prices. That increase will not be dramatic, is our best estimate, because farmers are not in a position to fully pass on cost increases to consumers. They will be able to pass some of the burden, but not all of it. So we have not found significant negative effects on income distribution, no significant increase in inequality across income groups. Also, we have not found very significant geographical effects of this carbon tax scheme, which is essentially, even though agriculture is more important for the local economy in some parts of the country than in others, naturally, agriculture does not account for a very large part of the total Danish economy, neither in terms of output nor employment. So there won't be, in our estimate, serious sort of inequalities across different regions of Denmark. Those are two important concerns by policymakers, which is why we have made some effort to analyze it seriously. So I think I'm happy to answer any questions on details you might have, but I think I'll leave it here. I've already taken enough time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. I'll just give some brief comments as well. We are an environmental organization. We're trying to set tasks, have an agenda of more ambitious goals for this transition on also for the farmers, trying to deliver on our climate goals, on our climate law in Denmark. We see it's a very difficult task, of course, and the political terrain in Europe is quite turbulent right now. And also in Denmark will be very difficult. But I would really praise the efforts made by the economists here to make really solid estimates on what will happen in different scenarios. And it's very important and crucial we have this fundament to have a serious conversation about these details, because there's a lot of fake news out there. There are farmers as well mobilizing on the basis of denial of the climate change that's happening right now. We also have this in Denmark, so we have kind of Trumpism as well in Denmark. So the political landscape is quite turbulent, and I think the political parties, that'll be the very interesting thing if they will dare to pick one of those models given to them by the economists. We, of course, in Green Transition Denmark would like them to choose model number one. It's a very ambitious model, at least internationally. We have to recognize that New Zealand have tried for 20 years to actually to implement a kind of carbon taxation, and they're failing and failing and failing. So it's very, very difficult. And we also should understand the political landscape. We have a majority government, but they won't do this without a broad support in the parliament. So we have the three parties negotiations with also people representing the farmers' associations and also some environmental organizations and trade unions and the Danish industry, having to negotiate on top of those recommendations made by the economists. So it's, of course, now we have a solid basis for this, but we see at Green Transition Denmark, we see a risk that politicians will not show leadership at this crucial time of history, because it's really, we are in the midst of dramatic climate changes. Those climate changes are also affecting farmers, the yields of farmers already in Europe and in Denmark as well. The seasons are more and more turbulent. So there is no business as usual. Whatever politicians decide to do, if they want to decide to sit on their hands, everything will change. Just one figure. In the last 12 years, 42% of all full-time farmers in Denmark have disappeared. So we have a huge structural transformation going on already. Whatever happens and whatever not will be decided at the political level, there will be a lot of change. Then we'll have the climate changes, of course, putting forward a lot of pressure on farmers as well. Then we also have a transformation in the market and the values among consumers. We see a growth in some of the, at least some of the parts of the ecological demand, and in regenerative agriculture. We see even big companies like Carlsberg have set a goal of 100% regenerative agriculture demand in 2040. They will have zero emission agriculture in 2040. So there's also pressure from some of the big buyers on the market. So it's not only about, of course, how the particular Danish citizen will react to these kind of political decisions which are going to be made. It's also about the pressure from the market right now. And we see a change in values, a set of things on this. But of course, there is, I think there is a risk that they will pick what I call an Aalborg Portland model, the cement industry, with a very low carbon taxation for farmers, maybe even to 125 here in this proposal, the Model 3 here, with a lot of focus on technical possibilities, potentials of new technologies coming in. And I think, at least in the report, it's very clear, reading the report, that there are a lot of uncertainties around several of those technologies. Of course, in the future, they might be part of the solution. But in the short run, until 2030, it's very difficult to apply those technologies and to get the reductions made that we need, according to the climate law. So therefore, you have to also focus on the economic incentives. And we hope they will decide for very ambitious incentives, although we have the fear that there will be a kind of political mess up, and they will end up choosing a very bad outcome, and also with higher economically costs for this, where we see that the Model 1 suggested by the economists is actually the cheapest model, total view on economic costs, and is also having the most environmental positive side effects. We have to understand, in Denmark we have a lot of our seas are threatened right now because of fertilizers, overconsumption of fertilizers for many years to our local, also local coasts, and also rivers or whatever. We have a lot of problems with pollution, also our drinking water, etc. So there are a lot of side effects of what kind of model we choose, and I think it's very. I appreciate that very much, that you also have been focused in the report on the question of fertilizers and the possibilities also using the current subsidies given to agriculture. And I'll just end up with one final figure. If Danish agriculture today should pay 750 kroners per ton CO2 emissions equivalents, it will be the same as the amount of subsidies given to directly and indirectly to agriculture today in Denmark, around 11.88 billion kroners. That is the current price, or at least its incentives given from the state to farmers, and we think that it's important to try to adjust some of those support schemes right now, both at the national level and also the European level, and also to look further ahead, not only to 2030, but also looking towards 2045, where the government has set a goal of zero emissions in Denmark. And I also appreciate that point in the Economist report. I think it's very important that we should not only think about 2030 goals, we also to create the structure, the architecture for the future regulations of our farming sector, so it will be within planetary boundaries in the future and will deliver on the climate goals. So we'll have a new generation of carbon farmers, not those who are today that have a very destructive practice if you look at environmental side effects currently, and it's not healthy and it's not viable in the future to follow that path. We have to make a transformation, but we also have to put the money back into the agricultural sector so it will allow them to make a green transition. So the money should not be given to the state, it should go back to the industry in order to ensure a faster green transformation of the sector. That's at least our point of view. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Bjarke. We'll now open up for questions. So I just want to check here in the room. Yeah, I see a couple of hands. And then we'll also go to you guys who are joining us on Zoom. If you could be kind just to write your question in the chat, then I'll try to read it out from here. But I see a couple of hands. I think I'll go to Staffan first, then Stefan. If you could be kind just to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Staffan Dahlev. I'm a Swedish freelancer, but I work also for Danish and European outlets. I'm trying to figure out how much this is a Danish initiative and how it fits into a broader European concept. I think it was interesting to learn what you said, Peter, about the data already in possession of Danish authorities regarding nitrogen, use of fertilizers and animals. Then I wonder, you also have data from the Common Agriculture Policy, the direct support according to size of farmland and according to historical production. And if that's not usable without big bureaucracy, then this might be a Danish model and not very suitable for the rest of Europe. And adding to that, we've seen the last months or so a backtracking from the EU Commission regarding farm policies like the program from fork to farm, pesticides, etc. So again, how does this play into the bigger European concept? Thank you.
Yeah, it's of course a very relevant question, because I mean we do hope that this initiative might serve as a source of inspiration for other countries. I imagine that many of the pieces of information that we are using to calculate emissions from Danish farm units will also be available in other European countries. As I think I mentioned, a lot of the information is actually part of the attempt by authorities to secure against animal diseases and help to stop the spread of an animal disease. For that purpose, the Ministry for Agriculture needs to know, I mean, how many animals and what type of animals exist on different farm units. I imagine that a lot of other EU countries will have the same kind of information for veterinary reasons. But that can also be used for this tax scheme. And similarly, Denmark is not the only country, I'm sure, that tries to regulate the use of nitrogen in agriculture. So, and part of this information is also part of the Common Agricultural Policy, because there are also subsidy schemes within the CAP to support sort of environmentally friendly initiatives, such as including initiatives that would also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I do believe that many other European member states will have much of the same information. So that is hopefully at least a partial answer to your question. There was you also, I'm not sure I answered all of your questions. Maybe you could repeat if there's something I haven't responded to.
No, just noticing that you could say the common agriculture policy now runs in a more, let's put it, farmer-friendly way than it did just a few months ago.
Yeah, that's
at least
right.
According to headlines.
Yeah.
So how does these things play out together?
Sure. We actually, in two of our models, we also describe as a possible alternative to a tax on fertilizer use. We suggest that member states could, or that the Danish government could decide to use some of the income support, area-based income support to farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy. They could use that more actively to give a subsidy to reduced use of fertilizer or manure on the land, so that on a net basis you don't really increase the fiscal burden on farmers. You just use the CAP subsidies in a more active way, so that you actually induce farmers to reduce their emissions. That might be a politically more viable way, and it's allowed within within certain limits under the Common Agricultural Policy, and that would, I think, at least until recently, the trend in the Common Agricultural Policy has been towards redirecting some of the unconditional subsidies that we've given to farmers just on the basis of how much land they own, to redirect some of this money towards supporting various environmentally friendly initiatives, and I think that will still be the long run trend, even though there may be a temporary backlash these days. But just to indicate that we do describe this alternative, right, which may be more politically acceptable.
Yes, my name is Steffen Trumpf from the German news agency DPA. Thanks, first of all, that you're here. That's very interesting to talk about this topic. Speaking again about the broader European picture, we've seen farmers' protests in Germany, France, Netherlands. I think right now we see them also in Poland and Greece, Belgium, you name it, like multiple countries, but not in Denmark yet. I think Bjarke, you described it as a turbulent landscape we are in, which is the nice way of saying it's tough. I'm wondering, is it bad timing to bring out this initiative, or like the conclusion now, or the report? And what is being done to kind of get the farmers in the boat, so to avoid such protests in Denmark?
Maybe would you?
I can just a few comments. The Danish model is, of course, characterized by negotiations between the different parties. So they're trying to solve this with this negotiation, three-part negotiation, where the farmers' association is also taking at least trying to give some inputs to this process. I don't know if they will actually be supportive of the final solution, because they are split inside among the agricultural associations, and some more radical farmers are trying to organize, and they will eventually, with this proposal, I'm sure they'll have their tractors driving into Copenhagen. It will happen in Denmark as well. there are people who actually think that the only way is to show anger, is the only way to defend oneself from change. But my message is that they will not avoid change, because it will happen anyway. On the market basis, just one example, last 1 year, the reduction of the pig production in Denmark has been 1.5 million pigs reduced due to market prices. Danish farmers are used to transformations and change all the time, continuously transformations. But of course, the political landscape, there will be a political backlash. The European backlash also feed into the Danish debate. We have a European parliamentary election, so there are interests in order to create a clash among interests. But the case is that it's a very small part of the Danish economy, but there's still a lot of production of food in Denmark, and also among trade unions who want to also defend the jobs, current jobs. But what I see the possibilities that politicians actually using what is the overall income from this new carbon tax in order to reinvest in agriculture. Maybe you can find a solution where agricultural, at least parts of the agricultural society in Denmark, or parts of among some farmers, they will see benefits in this. So they will see the value in investing in future solutions that can also drive future demand and things like that, with investments in new technologies or whatever. You will see a transformation of the Danish agricultural industry. But of course, it's very, very difficult right now, and they feel pressure. The debt amount is 285 billion Danish kroner currently. Only half of the income currently is related to the income they get from the support schemes, currently support schemes. So there are a lot of farmers out there who are not having a profitable business, and they feel threatened. But I think the task for politicians is actually to calm the sentiments and try to make a solution that will feed into a reinvestment in this green transformation of our sector. And I think if Denmark can't do this, if we can't be the test bed of this transformation, I think the rest of Europe might fail as well. Because we have this, at least historical, the capacity to make broad political solutions, compromises, and trying to find a common denominator to help push forward change. But if Denmark can't do it, I'm very uncertain if Europe will be able to deliver, at least for the farming sector.
Thank you. And before we go to the next question, I see a couple of more hands. And just to repeat that for our journalists on Zoom, please write your questions in the chat if you have any, then we'll try to accommodate from here. But otherwise, I think we got Lena.
Hi, my name's Lena. I'm the editor of the Copenhagen Post. I'd like to hear a little bit more about why you say that Model 1 has the best environmental effects and why you prefer it to Model 2, when it seems to be that the financial return for farmers, which could help with the purchase of green technologies or a shift to regenerative agriculture, they are more supported in Model 2. So why is it that you have such a preference for Model 1?
That's a question to you, Bjarke.
It is.
As I mentioned, the expert group has not given an explicit recommendation of one over the other models. We're just describing these alternatives and emphasize that the choice between them requires some political judgment that we don't feel that we can sort of, as so-called researchers, we cannot sort of make these political judgments on behalf of the policymakers. But it is. But that said, and you can take over then, Bjarke. I mean, it is a case that this Model 1, because it generates more greenhouse gas reductions. With that also comes greater benefits in terms of reduced pollution, water pollution, reduced emission of ammonia, and so on. But it comes at the cost of, as you say, at the cost to farmers and at the cost of a larger reduction in food production. So there is this choice which is more or less inevitable, that you have to trade off these things.
I'm just referring to the estimates of the shadow prices, economical shadow prices, that actually in report 59, page 59 of the report. And there's also some estimates of the beneficial that Peter commented on, the beneficial side effects on, for instance, ammonia and other things, environmental positive side effects. And I think it's more or less a double up in the Model 1 according to the Model 3B, so that it's more positive also in environmental terms. But of course there is those kind of trade-offs, negative trade-offs with employment. We see, at least in Green Transition Denmark, we think there are positive possibilities in a greater transformation of the environmental sector, because we know that if you go for more ecological, regenerative agriculture, it's more labor intensive actually than the high intensive agriculture we have nowadays, that actually is fed by fossil fuels globally, very cheap fossil fuels that is implemented with high machines. But you have another kind of soil treatments, etc. It's more, you need more jobs actually, but that is not modeled in this report. Well, there is a lot into that conversation, new kinds of local produced food, etc., etc. We see a possibility in that area as well, but we have to have a conversation about how we can, for instance, transform the European subsidies. There is possibility, eco schemes, going from area support for owners, those who have the big landowners, to those who are actually delivering climate positive effects. We should think about that kind of things as well. But of course, it's not been the task for the economists to model that and give answers to that. It's only the climate issue. But we, at least in our organization, would like that have a broader, holistic conversation about what should be the future of Danish agriculture, and how do we actually deal with those very challenging tasks we have, or challenges we have on climate, nature, biodiversity, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have to think broader. But of course, that's a big conversation. Open that as well.
Yeah. Okay, so none of the models include an increased subsidy. They include a potential tax break.
I mean, there are in fact subsidies to the use of certain technologies, emission-reducing technologies in our Model 3, which is sort of the model that is imposes the lowest burden on farmers. We do propose subsidies to the use of biochar, which is a way of storing carbon in the land, based on, is it pyrolysis in English? I think it is, based on the process of pyrolysis. This will require a guarantee that the biomass that has been used to produce a biochar is not contaminated, so that there's no environmental problem. But there is a long-run potential for having negative net emissions from agriculture, or at least compensating for the inevitable positive emissions by storing carbon in the land, in the fields, via biochar, and we propose to subsidize the further development of that technology as one example. And so using the revenue, or part of the revenue, actually we spend more than the revenue on various subsidies to future technologies in that Model 3. But again, I mean, the money will have to come from somewhere else, right? So again, it's a political choice of distribution between the farming sector and the rest of, and the taxpayers in general, right?
Thank you. Online, we've got Emma from Financial Times with a couple of questions. So we'll take the first question first. She says, you referred to New Zealand, saying that they have been trying to do this for 20 years or so. She asked, what has been the problems there, and do you think the same hurdles could impact the policy issue and the implementation here in Denmark?
They tried several things in New Zealand, but I think the current right-wing government will backtrack on the proposals made by the former Labour government. So, and they are driving more towards technological fixes, less on carbon taxation. That has been the trend. Originally was an idea to create a kind of taxation on methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. But this is, of course, the political landscape in New Zealand has been transformed, and tractors on the streets, etc., mobilization among farmers, created some kind of political caution. And now, right now, we'll see what the new government elected in autumn will deliver on this. But I think it's a good case on how difficult it is actually to transform the farming sector, because it also raises fears about our society, our identity, as a farming nation, farming culture, and therefore there are many other things in this equation that is not only about economics.
If I may supplement by pointing to one factor that makes Denmark's situation a bit different from New Zealand's. I mean, the common characteristics are that both in Denmark and in New Zealand, there's a large export of food export. But Denmark is a member of the European Union and is obliged as a European member state to reduce emissions from the non-ETS sectors by a certain amount by 2030. And the largest part of those emissions outside the ETS comes from the farming sector. So if we are to live up to our obligations towards the EU, it's almost inevitable that we have to do something to cut emissions from agriculture. It may then not be that the politicians are ready to impose a relatively high tax to meet the target, but then they will have to do something else. Because otherwise, otherwise we will not be able to meet our international climate obligations. So something I'm sure will happen.
Thank you. The second question, Peter, I'm not quite sure if you got the mandate to answer this, but now we'll try. They asked, what do you think it's for both of you? What is, if we take the three options you have presented today, what is the most likely that the Danish government will go with?
That's for you, Bjarke.
You're not able to answer that. Okay, I will have the. I think actually there is a lot of possibility that they'll go for a Model 2 with some kind of deductions at the bottom. So at least to get some kind of lower taxation rate for the farmers. You can also see the estimates on economics. There are lower impacts on the loss of jobs, etc. And it's the middle of the road. They will tend to choose that kind of thing. But due to government internal differences and policies, for instance, the moderates, I think, will be very proactively supporting a model like that, maybe even with some kind of consumption taxes, even though the economists don't like that. They might put this on top of that. But on the Liberal Party will not really go for a Model 3. I'm sure that, quite sure that. They will try to fight for Model 1. And the Social Democrats have a lot of voters who love meat.
Are you saying that the Liberal Party,
Venstre,
will
I think they will
go for Model 1?
No, Model 3. Model 3. Sorry, Model 3. Sorry, that was just a slip of the tongue. And they're the lowest impact for farmers. And where the Social Democrats, I would think they will be able to go for a Model 2, something like that. But there are also a lot of other parties in these negotiations. And I think it will be eventually, I think they will also, on top of maybe Model 2, they will put a lot of technological support schemes as well. That at least is the trend. Denmark is the one, I would just make one jump out of this debate, but it's a very parallel debate about what we do to industry. Denmark is the country that is actually, have the most ambitious goals of how to reduce with carbon capture and storage until 2030. We are counting it before 2030. We expect it to drive millions of tons reductions before 2030. In the European Union, nobody is talking about that. So, and I think it's pie in the sky to my mind. It's very ambitious, very unlikable that they will reach those goals in carbon capture and storage. And the same thing will be those technological misses that paralyzes here. Just in the report mentioned, you will have to review in your support model, a review in 2027. But it's not viable that you will have at least 50 pyrolysis production plants around Denmark in just such a short time, because it's a huge investment and it's a high cost, and I think it's not viable. So you have to find other kinds of reductions if you have to comply with the EU regulations.
Thank you. For the journalists on Zoom, just again, we'll just call out if you've got any questions, please write them in the chat. Other than that, Bente, I think you've got a question?
Yeah. Hi. Bente Knudsen from your Danish Life. Just to stay in the European context, have you been able to, in your report, to take into fact the impact of imports of food produce in Denmark? Because the French, for instance, are protesting again today, the French farmers, and one of their main arguments is, what about the imports? The countries that will not be putting on taxation on food produce. So, for instance, how much of Danish food consumption actually comes from imports that will then not have any taxation on? Have you been able to look at that?
Yes, we have. I mean, this relates to this question of carbon leakage. I mean, if we impose a tax on Danish food production, to what extent will that induce consumers to shift towards imported food products? That is something we have analyzed. Most of Danish food consumption is consumption of Danish-produced foods, but we do have some imports, of course, particularly of various vegetables. Vegetables will not become a lot more expensive even if they're produced in Denmark, because they're not so emission-intensive production of those are not so emission intensive. But we don't expect to see a large increase in imports, because there's a lot of evidence that Danish consumers have sort of a bias towards consuming Danish-produced food. Various statistical analyses of what determines food consumption, suggests that the demand for Danish-produced food is not very sensitive to price changes. There is some sensitivity, of course, but Danish consumers appear to be fairly loyal towards Danish brands. That said, I mean, we do expect to see some increase in imports, and that is part of the reason for this expected fall in Danish agricultural production. Part of that is caused by a loss of market share against foreign competitors, meaning increased imports. So we have accounted for that as best as we can.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, just a second. I'm just trying to get it here. Can I see it? Oh, yes. We've got a question here from a journalist in Finland, I believe. What about land use? Would farmland be used in future for reforestation? Yeah, makes sense?
A lot of sense, and actually that was one of the relatively important details I didn't get to mention. In all of these tax schemes that we're proposing, we are also including subsidies to reforestation, changing land use from agricultural use to forestry. That is a common element in all of our models. The Danish government does have a target of increasing the forest area in Denmark, and we propose to accelerate that by increasing subsidies to the changing of land use from agriculture to forestry. So that's and particularly in the longer run, beyond 2030, that contributes with quite a significant reduction in, because of its carbon storage in forests. It contributes a lot to reducing emissions beyond 2030. We also include in all models subsidies to taking out low-lying farmlands and turning them into wetlands, taking them out of agricultural use and turning them into wetlands, so that the current carbon emissions from those areas, which are quite significant, are more or less eliminated. So those are two important examples of land use changes that we are proposing. So thank you for that relevant question.
Thank you. Another question from Zoom is probably directed to you guys at the expert group. Has there been any kind of collaboration or consultation with other Nordic countries or people working along the same lines in the Nordic region?
Not a lot, I must say, even though I myself have collaborated with many good colleagues from the Nordic countries over the years, but we haven't really have much interaction on this particular issue. We've also taken notice that the current Swedish government seems to be rather reluctant to introduce climate regulation of agriculture. But we actually did look at the New Zealand experience, trying to understand what they have been trying to do and why they have failed. You've already explained that very well, Bjarke. Thank you for that. But we, I mean, honestly, there isn't much. There isn't really any country so far that has tried to implement such a tax. So we've tried to sort of work from basics and hope. But we really hope that there will be an international discussion of this. I know the European Commission has recently published some studies about the possibilities of perhaps introducing a common a sort of emissions trading scheme for agriculture, which would ideally be, I mean, based on emission accounts for individual farm units, but that is considered to be administratively difficult at the moment. But we hope maybe the Danish experience can help other European countries to move in the same direction.
Maybe in the 2030s.
Yeah.
2030s.
Yeah, but we also have some long run climate targets. So this is a long time journey, right?
Thank you. It will soon be coming up to 4 o'clock, but I think we've got room for one more question from here. Otherwise, again from Zoom, a topic we haven't touched upon, but maybe Peter, you could say a few words about it. How will these, I know you probably, or you have done some calculations at least on what could happen to food prices for the consumers going down to the supermarket to buy different food items. Could you just briefly brief us on the
Yeah. We don't expect any dramatic increases in food prices. At the most, I mean, the most carbon-intensive foodstuff is beef, and we expect that under this Model 1, which is the toughest model, if you like, the consumer prices of beef products could go up by 10%, which is, of course, not negligible, but after all, beef is only part of a household's food budget. Then if for pig meat, it's about I think half that price increased, in the order of 5%, and for milk it's lower than that, 2%, I think, something like that. And those are the most carbon-intensive products in or CO2 equivalent intensive, greenhouse gas intensive products. Other food products, including a lot of vegetables, will have negligible price increases according to our best estimates. So that is also why we don't expect. I mean, there's a concern that this will disproportionately hurt poor people who have to use a lot of their household budget on foodstuff, but and there's a little effect in that direction, but it's very small. I mean, actually, rich people also consume a lot of beef, not to me. There isn't a significant negative impact on income distribution from consumer price increases of food, according to our analysis, which I think is also an important message, because it's naturally a concern for policymakers, but our calculations indicate that at least in the Danish context, it shouldn't be a big concern.
Okay, and I think Peter and Bjarke, with that, we'll wrap it up for today. Thanks to the audience online and also to the journalists here in the room. I'm sure that both Peter and Bjarke going forward will be able to help you with further questions as well that might arise. Now, of course, it will go into the political level in Denmark for further scrutiny and debate. But thanks a lot, both of you, for coming here today, giving us this update and more details. So till next time, thanks.
Thank you for your interest.